Hi, I'm Patrick Scott. Welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. We're going to be continuing our discussion today about bureaucracy, and there's a couple of different things I really want to talk about during this section on bureaucracy. I want to deal with the issue about whether or not bureaucracy is raging out of control. Is bureaucracy raging out of control? And we're going to deal with that question, yes or no. And then another question related to that is the idea of why is bureaucracy so inefficient? If it is inefficient, why is it so inefficient? And why did we structure bureaucracy the way we did? Is this any way to run a government? So let's talk about that issue first of all. Is this really any way to run a government? When we have, as you know, and let's look at bureaucracy as an institution and compare it to the presidency and to Congress. And as we know, first of all, that bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. The president is the chief executive, sits ideally on top of the executive branch to carry out policies that are passed by, and laws that are passed by Congress. Well, funding for bureaucracy comes from Congress. It was the president and Congress working together. All right? But in a lot of ways, you may say, because of the fact that on the one hand, the president controls bureaucracy, and yet Congress also controls bureaucracy through the purse strings. And if you want to go even further, even the Supreme Court exercises some control over what bureaucracy can or cannot do. What I'm suggesting to you in a lot of ways is that bureaucracy has more than one master. Now, bureaucracy has at least two masters, if not three masters, because it serves the president, bureaucracy serves Congress. Programs that are created in bureaucracy are created by Congress when Congress passes a law. This is called statutory authority, statutory authorization, when they pass a statute to create or speak an agency into existence. So on the one hand, you've got Congress as a controller of bureaucracy, you've got the president as a controller of bureaucracy or master of bureaucracy, and then also you may have the Supreme Court. Is that really, how can you have an efficient government when you have more than one master? A lot of times I tell my students, have you ever been in a job situation where you've actually been asked to where you served at the same time more than one boss? And did it drive you crazy? Because one boss may want you to do one thing at a particular point in time, and at that same point in time, another boss wants you to do something else that's contradictory, and it can drive you crazy. It is not a model of efficient governance, is it? Well, in a lot of ways, our system, our Constitution, as we've talked about before, is deliberately designed to be inefficient and highly decentralized. And in a lot of ways, bureaucracy is a reflection of those dynamics at work. We did not, despite the fact that people have called for bureaucracy to be run like a business and to be more efficient and these kinds of things, we designed it in such a way, first of all, that would have more than one master. Well, is that any way to have efficiency in government if you're going to have more than one master? Well, again, why did we do that? Because we wanted to have more voices, more accountability, more democracy, more voices basically being reflected in terms of bureaucratic policies and procedures and regulations, so that it's not just reflecting again that concentration of power. So we see on the one hand then bureaucracy, we deliberately designed bureaucracy not to be efficient because it has more than one master. But let me give you something else too. When we're talking about in terms of political appointees versus the career bureaucrats. All right. Now we know that career bureaucrats have a lot of expertise. They've been there for a long time. Their longevity outlasts the longevity and the tenure of their political bosses. But oftentimes their political bosses are not the experts. The people who are their bosses are often there because they are based upon patronage or loyalty to the president. They're hired on the basis of political loyalty. And they may not necessarily be an expert in a given area. And their view is that that's okay because you could have a person with some generic management training and they should be able to work in any agency. As long as you've got the managerial and leadership skills, you don't have to have necessarily the expertise. That's the idea behind the political appointees who head up our bureaucracy. As long as you have experts that are on tap, they don't have to be on top, but they have to be on tap, then these generalist managers could actually be effective in terms of managing the bureaucracy. But in other cases, political appointees, they may not have the expertise, but yet here they are, presumably making decisions, speaking with the voice of the president, to direct an agency to carry out policies in accordance with the president's wishes. But yet, again, they may not necessarily be the experts. And so here we have a group of career experts, people who are highly technically trained in their areas and who've been there for quite some time, who are taking orders from people who are more or less, who don't have anywhere near as much knowledge as those below them. Is that any way to run a government? I guess. So you've got a couple of different kinds of inefficiencies kind of built into that. We've talked about that before as to why we do that. That harkens back to the spoils system, to allow the president to have some control over the nature and the direction of bureaucracy. But again, if you were to look at in terms of how bureaucracy is set up and organized, the fact that it serves more than one master, and the fact that it's actually organized internally in terms of having people at the top who are, in many cases, less knowledgeable than people below them, again, are some dynamics that take place that make it very difficult sometimes for things to get done. And again, you're looking at it from a whole perspective, and you say, is this really any way we want to have our government run? And of course the answer is yes and no. Certainly if we can make bureaucracy more efficient, that's good, but we have to think about what are the trade-offs involved in making it more efficient. Now, when we were finishing up our discussion our last time, we were talking about the fact that bureaucracy has a lot of power, a lot of resources. We talked about the expertise, the discretion, the authority, the resources to make decisions to carry out vague congressional mandates in a way that bureaucracy thinks is practical and workable, and which may or may not feel congressional and meet congressional intentions or president's intentions. But nonetheless, it has a lot of discretion to determine how these laws will be implemented. And because of these types of conditions and dynamics and resources and training of bureaucrats, that becomes a very important source of power for bureaucracy. And because bureaucracy is powerful, then it immediately brings a question as to whether or not bureaucracy is being adequately controlled. We're concerned as a society and in terms of democracy whether or not there are adequate controls of bureaucracy. How do we make sure that bureaucracy serves the interest of our society? How do we make sure that bureaucracy serves the public, the people, the public interest, democracy, as opposed to serving its own interest or as opposed to serving some kind of special interest? And in a lot of ways, this speaks to another kind of issue that I think is kind of interesting too. So I'll talk to you a little bit about this. This is sort of a theory that people talk about in terms of bureaucracy. It's known as principal agent theory. Principal agent theory. Principal agent theory is actually used in a lot of different areas, and in terms of in the business research and business literature, talking about contracts and how to oversee contracts. In political science and public administration, we employ this idea, this notion of principal agent models to describe the relationship between bureaucracy and other entities. So on the one hand, some people think about this. If you think about, first of all, in terms of principals versus agents, principals are I can think about it as a person who wants to have something done, and the agent is the person or entity that's actually doing the work on behalf of the principal. Now the problem here in the principal agent models is that the agent has more expertise than the principal. There's a term that some scholars use called information asymmetry. The agent has more information than the principal, and so as part of this, might the agent engage in behaviors that serve its own interest as opposed to the interest of the principal? How do we know the agent is going to do the work of the principal? And I'll give you a very simple example close to home that you can relate to that really illustrates how this model works, and then we'll go back and apply it to bureaucracy. I remember way back when I had an old car and I was in college, and back then the alternator had something that it worked with called the regulator. Now today's alternators in cars, the regulator is built inside the alternator, and so if your alternator goes bad, it could be the regulator, but in any case you've got to get a new alternator or a rebuilt alternator. Well, back then in the olden days, back when I was in college, in this car, again being an old car that it was, the regulator was separate from the alternator. The alternator, to get a rebuilt alternator way back then, was about $150 or so to replace. The regulator was only $15 to replace. Well, I remember one day my engine light came on and they checked the battery. It wasn't the battery. And I took it to this mechanic, and the mechanic looked at that and said, no, your battery's fine, must be the alternator. And so the first thing that he did was to replace the alternator with a new, well, rebuilt alternator. And he says, that'll be $155. And of course, back then, $155 was a lot of money, big chunk of change. So as I was trying to crank it up to drive it out after the new alternator was put in, it still was doing the very, very same thing, and the engine light came on. And then the mechanic says, oh, I bet you also need a regulator. So he put the regulator in, and guess what? It cranked right up. Well, here I was scratching my head thinking, did I just need a regulator and not an alternator? Did I just get shafted for $155 or $150 or whatever it was, when all I really needed to pay was $15 to have that regulator replaced? And I was young and naive and didn't feel like I could question his authority, and so I just kind of drove off much poorer, but my car was running. But that question always nagged me, because I realized at the time, logically even, it suggested that it wasn't the problem with the alternator, it was really the regulator. But I kept thinking, well, I'll probably have to get a new alternator down the road anyway, so I guess now I'm okay for a while. So I tried to rationalize my hesitation of confronting the mechanic. Well, that to me is a good example of the principal-agent model at work, because on the one hand, me being the principal, the mechanic being the agent, he's doing the work of the principal. That is what I want him to do, put a new alternator or fix my car. But how do I? But we have information asymmetry at work, because he had a lot more information about what works and what doesn't work than I did, and it was hard for me to try to reduce that discrepancy. Well, that same idea applies when we start talking about bureaucracy. You can think of it in a lot of ways as the public or as the Congress or the presidency as being the principal, and the agent as being bureaucracy as an institution. And so the principal wants the agent to do things. How do we make sure that the agent does what the principal wants it to do? The principal being, again, the president, the Congress, or the people. How do we know, because of the information asymmetry, because we know the fact that the bureaucracy has all these experts in there, how do we know that they will actually carry out the work of the principal? And how do we reduce that information asymmetry possibly? All right, but that's the idea of the principal-agent model at work. And the same thing happens if we were actually to peer down in bureaucracy and look deep down inside and start looking at the political appointees and the career executives, the career bureaucrats there, and look at them and say, okay, well, you can look at the political appointees as being the principals and the career bureaucrats as being the agents. How do the principals, in this case the political appointees, know that the agents, that is the career bureaucrats, will carry out their wishes, you see, when after all the career bureaucrats have much more expertise. So that's kind of the idea and the problems of the principal agent model that applies here. So largely then what we're suggesting is this, is that given its power and resources, what can we do to make sure that bureaucracy acts responsibly? How do we know that bureaucracy will serve the public interest and not be guided by its own self-interest? And after all, think about this. Bureaucrats are not elected. As one scholar talked about, they are 3 times or thrice removed from public accountability and control, because the people elect representatives, the representatives select political appointees, be it the president in this case, selects political appointees, and the political appointees control the bureaucrats. So in a lot of ways you can look at bureaucrats as being 3 times removed from the people. Because bureaucrats are not elected, because they are removed from the political process, because they have these built-in merit-based protections, all right, they're relatively safe, and yet they're charged with the task of making and carrying out very important government policies and programs, where the rubber meets the road, as I was talking about before. So, how do we ensure that bureaucracy will carry out the public interest? How do we control bureaucracy? All right, well, one of the ways in which we've done this and try to do this is by saddling bureaucracy with controls. I talk to a lot of people and I will ask them, do you think bureaucracy is raging out of control? And a lot of people say, of course they are. Yes, they're raging out of control. Well, let me talk to you about some controls that are placed on bureaucracy and see if you come up with the same assessment at the end of this discussion. And we could basically take 2 broad categories of controls, external controls and internal controls. And let's look first of all at some various external controls placed upon bureaucracy. One way to ensure that bureaucrats are responsive to elected officials is through various kinds of congressional controls. There's congressional controls, for example, presidential controls, judicial controls. Let's talk specifically, first of all, about congressional controls. As I mentioned, first of all, Congress has statutory authority that basically speaks an agency into a place. No agency or department can exist without congressional authorization. Congress will pass a law that basically authorizes the creation of an agency. If a Congress can speak an agency into existence, guess what? Congress could theoretically pass a law that eliminates that agency, right? So they have statutory authority. But again, is that an effective control? Probably not, because it's hard to actually eliminate an agency once it's been created if it's doing some good things. What about in terms of budget authority? As you know, Congress and the President work together to create the budget of the United States government. I've mentioned this before, that the President will submit a budget to Congress in January of a given year, and ideally by October 1st, that's when the next fiscal year begins. So Congress has from January through the end of September to work on the budget, the President's budget for that fiscal year, to mark it up, to modify it, and make changes to it. So Congress has the authority and budgetary authority, and Congress authorizes funding levels for programs. It's the Congress and the President working together. But basically, Congress has plenty of time to mark it up and change it and make alterations from the President's recommendations from that, whether to increase the President's budget in given areas or to reduce the President's budget in given areas. But again, is that an effective form of authority? It may be to some degree, but again, how effective makes you wonder sometimes. We talked about, in terms of our discussion on Congress, that Congress engages a lot of their activity, their staff people are engaged in casework, and that is solving specific problems of constituents. Many of these kinds of problems may relate to problems they're having with bureaucracy. I remember, in terms of the Bureau of Export Administration, what we did was process export license applications. If a computer company was trying to export some sensitive computer equipment over to another country, and it had its computer equipment was actually sitting on the dock waiting to be shipped, it had to have that export license approved before it could be shipped. And there might be somebody who's head of this export firm or computer firm who may be calling up their member of Congress, and the member of Congress is saying, why are you delaying this or denying this person's export license application? And so, again, this is the idea of casework. You may have a problem as a citizen with a particular agency. The Social Security Administration, as I mentioned before, may have declared your grandmother deceased, and you saw your grandmother yesterday, and you know she's not deceased and she's doing just fine. And so she's losing her Social Security check, and she shouldn't be. And so these are some examples where Congress will get involved in interfacing with other agencies, and in a lot of ways, on a piecemeal, case-by-case basis, this is a way for Congress to exert control of bureaucracy. Again, because it is case-by-case, it's not a very effective form of control necessarily. It gets more and more case-by-case. But again, we've also talked about ways in which Congress exercises oversight of various federal agencies. We talked about, for example, congressional hearings where members of the bureaucracy are required to go and testify before Congress regarding their programs, their agencies, their budgets. We've talked about that before. And many types of laws that are passed that authorize the establishment of an agency often have, accompanying with that, periodic reports that Congress requires that the agency provide. Maybe every 3 months or every 6 months, they want the agency to provide a report detailing specifically how they're doing and what kinds of accomplishments they're making. So there might be an annual report given to Congress, but also maybe every 3 months or every 6 months a report, follow-up and an update report given to members of Congress. And that's another way of holding bureaucracy accountable. We talked also about the various staff agencies like the Government Accountability Office. Whenever a member of Congress may hear of some kind of scandal or waste, fraud, or abuse going on in a given government agency, that member of Congress may actually call for an investigation where the Government Accountability Office will go over that agency, interview officials, look at and audit the agencies, audit their finances and these kinds of things, interview individuals and so forth, and create a report that investigates and in a lot of detail what's going on in this area. And they may write a report saying, here's what we found and here's ways to strengthen the management or the different kinds of processes at a given agency. And so, again, these are ways in which Congress does exercise control over federal departments and agencies. Now, besides congressional controls, another form of an external control is a presidential control. And again, budget power, the budgetary controls are part of that. So we talked about that the president shares with Congress. The president decides what the level of funding should be for a given agency, for different policy, for different programs. And oftentimes, the president will then work with Congress to establish what will have his budget, and Congress will mark it up. But oftentimes, then again, the president does play a very important role in helping to establish the base general levels of the funding for the agency. Now, we could go into a lot more detail about the pluses and minuses of budgetary controls, but I just want you to know at this point that, again, that's a form of control that the president can use. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the idea of appointment power, the political appointees. The whole purpose of having that management team, all those political appointees, those 4,000 that we've mentioned, the purpose of these political appointees is to help make sure that when the president is elected and the president comes in, the president basically has a mandate from the people to carry out policies that the people want. And so as part of that process, the president has to rely upon bureaucracy. And the way the president gets bureaucracy to march in his direction is by staffing the agencies at the top level and even below those at other senior positions, but not just at the very top, but below to some degree, with top officials who share the president's philosophies and viewpoints, making sure that the agencies carry out the president's wishes. Okay? So you've got presidential controls there. And again, how effective are they? Well, you might see in this case that the president's appointment power should be a very strong control, but sometimes, though, my question is, in the day-to-day decision-making of a political appointee, does he or she always know what the president wants with respect to specific decisions? And in the specific warp and woof of decisions that are made on a daily basis, probably not as much. I mean, a general philosophy, yes, in terms of sharing the president's views and so forth, but in specific day-to-day decisions, there's no guarantee that the decisions of a political appointee are necessarily going to reflect the intentions of the president. Now, besides those types of controls, the presidential controls and congressional controls, we haven't really talked about this before, and we'll be talking more about the judiciary as an institution, in particular the Supreme Court, coming up soon. But there are judicial controls that are placed upon bureaucracy. When the federal judiciary, federal courts, including the Supreme Court, render decisions, these court cases may constrain what a federal agency may or may not do. And the courts have had a definite impact on a bureau's actions, and not only the federal, but also state and local levels too. For example, the federal courts have taken over state prisons, local school districts. They've told local governments how much money they must spend in a given area. But it may also be in terms of the federal government as well. If someone, for example, is suing the Environmental Protection Agency, claiming that the EPA is imposing unfair and overly harsh fines for pollution, it actually may go before, be heard by a federal judge, and the federal judge may rule in favor of the individual and constrain what the agency may do. And it reminds me, there's actually a pretty famous court case many years ago, back in about 1975, I believe, where in this case, a federal judge, this was actually dealing with the state administrator, but it's the same kind of principle that would apply here. In Alabama, there was, actually it wasn't prison, it was a mental health hospital. In Alabama, there was a mental health hospital, a state-run institution, and the administrator of this hospital didn't have a whole lot of money to work with to actually provide all the kind of care that people today, by modern day standards, would say would be appropriate. Well, this federal judge actually got involved in the case, and one of the people inside the institution complained about conditions, and their family sued on behalf of the person being held in the institution. And it came up before federal court. And the federal judge basically told this Alabama state administrator how he needed to change the way things were being operated in this institution. And so they got very detailed and very specific. He said, for example, from now on, you're going to make sure that everyone under your care has a minimum square foot living space, square footage of about something like 1,800 square foot per person on average. Or not 1,800 actually, that's way too much. But there's in their cells, 180 square feet per person. You shall make sure that the temperature in this facility, in the facility over which you have control, shall not go above 85 degrees or below 65 degrees. You shall make sure that everyone within your care has a minimum calorie count of 1,800 or so calories per day. But in this case here, basically showed a lot of examples where the federal judge was dictating to the administrator specifically what the administrator could or could not do. And again, that could apply to local governments, state governments, or even at the federal level. And so, for example, if someone here at the local federal jail here in Springfield, if the administrator were allowing people's constitutional rights to be violated, somebody could sue and the federal courts could get involved and say, this is what you have to make sure these kinds of controls are in place so their constitutional rights of due process and protections against cruel and unusual punishment are guaranteed. So anyway, the point here is that there are a lot of court cases that emanate that can constrain what bureaucracy does. And that goes back to my earlier point about how bureaucracy actually has three different masters. You've got the president as a master, the Congress as a master, and in several cases, the judiciary as a master. Now, other kinds of external controls would include the media. As we talked about the watchdog function of the media, that investigative function that journalists play to basically hold government accountable for what it does. You think about the Watergate and the role of the media, the journalists of the Washington Post that played a role in blowing open the Watergate investigation. So the media can play a role that and hold bureaucracy accountable. And as part of that, well, I'll move on because I had some other examples I want to share with that in terms of working with the media, but the media can certainly play an important role. There is an act called the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA. And if you as a citizen are interested in what a particular agency is doing, you can file a FOIA request, and the government has to respond to that request. They have a certain amount of deadline to do. Now, it may cost you some money for them to provide the information because they may have to go in their archives of documentation, but you may be interested in finding out what exactly did this agency do at this point in time in terms of maybe some medical experiments on individuals. And by filing a FOIA request, you can find out what information, what the government did or is doing. And some of that information may actually be crossed out to protect confidentiality because it's classified, but other information that's not classified or has been declassified, again, can be a very source of light showing what's going on inside the agency. So this idea of people who, and often journalists will submit FOIA requests to various agencies as part of their investigative functions of that watchdog role. To the extent, in terms of external controls, Congress will sometimes pass what's called sunset provisions in legislation. Basically it says that we're going to create a new program. That program has a 5-year window of existence. And once that 5 years is over, unless we reauthorize that program's continuation, that program is going to cease. That's known as sunset legislation. And again, that's a way to keep bureaucracy accountable as an external control. And then along the same lines, I think about sunshine laws. You've got sunset legislation, you've got sunshine laws. And sunshine laws are basically requirements that governments will pass, members of Congress will pass, that says that some business has to be conducted. And you see a lot of this also at the local level as well, but where they are required to conduct meetings in public audiences, unless for some specific confidential reasons they cannot do that. But this idea of sunshine laws is to help, again, kind of keep openness in terms of what's going on the inside of government. Nonetheless, I mean, that's a good example of the overview of, or a good overview of the different kinds of external controls that are available to keep bureaucracy in check. But besides external controls, there are also a myriad of internal controls. And a lot of people suggest that external controls are not sufficient. There is still some potential for abuse of power and authority that may be contrary to the public interest. And that, again, is part of the potential problem here. So besides external controls, we do have internal controls. And internal controls actually are a couple of different ideas here I want to share with you. One of which is this notion of ethics, or your conception of morality. And part of this also is your training, or your professional training and your professional socialization. And then a third thing is adherence to constitutional norms. Now, all of these, what I suggested there, are part of internal controls that guide you as a bureaucrat in terms of your decision. There's been a movement afoot about trying to encourage people to understand better of how the Constitution constrains the actions of public administrators. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of books that have been written, and as part of the training of federal executives of understanding how the Constitution and specific court cases that the Supreme Court and other courts have ruled upon that may potentially guide the actions of administrators that administrators need to be aware of as they go about their day-to-day training. So the idea of being imbued with a greater understanding of the Constitution, a greater understanding of how the courts are likely to apply constitutional principles in certain types of matters that affect how you practice. Those are examples of how this adherence to constitutional norms as an example of an internal control. Another example of an internal control that we're talking about is this idea of your conception of morality and also your professional training. And the idea behind particularly your training is that as you are trained as an expert in a given area, the more education you have, the more you are trained in a given area of your profession, the more you are steeped in the norms of that profession. The more professionalized you are and the more professionalized your occupation is, the more you're going to embody the values of that training. So for example, physicians have a high level of training in terms of what they consider to be appropriate practice and inappropriate practice. And again, you may have quacks that are out there, but by and large, the vast majority of physicians are going to be very, very careful about how they practice, about what they consider to be acceptable versus unacceptable norms or forms of their medical practice. The same thing happens with lawyers, journalists, and other professions, even academics. For example, we are very much trained in terms of what we consider to be appropriate or inappropriate forms of practice. And like, for example, in terms of research, if you're, in terms of collecting data, analyzing data, and so forth, we have to be accountable for how that data is collected, how that data is presented and analyzed. And people have gotten fired, for example, for fudging data results, trying to get a result designed to help ensure publications for tenure. I mean, that's a gross violation of academic norms. And my point here is that any of the professions that you find in government, to the extent that people are trained and immersed in the norms of that profession, they're going to let that profession serve as an inner check to guide their behavior. And that's a term that some scholars have used, this idea of inner check. So that will help them in terms of making sure that in their day-to-day practice, in their day-to-day analysis, in their day-to-day policy making, they're going to basically do it in such a way that reflects the norms and the training that they have invested many, many years in doing. Okay, and then another type of another type of internal norm or internal control is this idea that you see more of a structural kind of thing, and that is the existence of people who work in each agency. This is the internal counterpart to the Government Accountability Office. This is the Inspector Generals, the IGs. The Inspector Generals are offices within each of the federal departments, each of the agencies, that are basically responsible for carrying out audits, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. So in a lot of ways, you've got these internal investigators as well as these external investigators. The GAO is, again, their external counterpart. The GAO and IG staffs work quite a bit in investigating an agency many, many times. But that's, again, could be considered an internal control. And then when you have people who are practicing in bureaucracy and they are engaging in something called whistleblowing, where they see something going on, some kind of scandal, and they say this is wrong and we need to report this, and they may go to the Inspector General's office or they may go to the media and report their findings. That's another kind of example of internal control at work. So the point here is that there are a myriad of external controls in bureaucracy and internal controls. And so the question here is, what are they sufficient? And that's the $64 million question here. Because on the one hand, the best way to put this is that if you don't have enough control of bureaucracy, then what can happen? The very things that we fear, the fact that bureaucracy can make decisions that reflect its own prerogatives or reflect the interest of special interests that have a dominant influence in bureaucracy. So if you don't have enough control, you could have certainly a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. And we've heard stories about this too. For example, with government issued credit cards, there was one example where a federal employee had decided to use the credit card in a manner that was quite inconsistent with the purpose of the credit card, buying lavish trips to Vegas and buying his girlfriend certain gifts and things like that. So, and he was caught. But again, the point here is if you don't have enough adequate controls in place, you're going to have waste, fraud, and abuse. On the other hand, if you have too many controls in place, what are you going to have? You're going to have red tape, and you're going to have a slowed down decision-making process. And so too much control can lead to red tape. Not enough control can lead to waste, fraud, and abuse. And so trying to find the balance between having enough control but not too much control is a $64 million question. And it obviously changes from one agency to another agency, from one given decision context to another given decision context. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about in terms of bureaucracy, and this will wrap up our discussion, but we'll talk about one of the most recent areas of reform that embodies some interesting principles I want to share with you. And this actually is something known as reinventing government. And Reinventing Government, there was a book written by Osborne and Gabler called Reinventing Government. And in this, they enunciated various kinds of principles by which government could reinvent itself. And this was actually something that's very popular back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And when Al Gore was the Vice President of the United States, he was head of something called the National Performance Review, which took a lot of these ideas of reinventing government, tried to apply them in various kinds of ways into the public sector, the federal government. One of which was to reduce red tape and also to reduce the size of government as well. Another was to make government more customer-oriented, more customer-friendly. But this idea of reinventing government, I just want to share really briefly with you about some of the ideas that are involved in this and taking from the effort from the National Performance Review and from the book of Reinventing Government, just a few quick things. One of the things that it suggests, one of the principles of reinventing government, is that government should play more of a role, for example, what they say of steering rather than rowing. And so the idea behind this is that instead of actually delivering the services themselves, maybe what government should be involved in is actually playing more of a steering function, basically setting the direction that government wants it to go, but not necessarily getting involved in the day-to-day operational details. And as part of that, and kind of a related idea, is that involves the idea of contracting, injecting competition in terms of service delivery. Privatization is a big idea behind reinventing government. And those are all good things as well, as long, again, as you have adequate controls in place. Because if you have privatization, potentially, you can have some of the efficiencies that you take advantage of in the private sector, but at the same time, you may not have the accountability because you lengthen the accountability chain. Remember the time from the fact that bureaucrats are not directly accountable to citizens. They're like 3 times removed from the citizens. Well, the minute the bureaucrats are actually not performing the functions, but simply overseeing the functions performed by private sector suppliers or private sector entities, you lengthen that accountability chain unless you have adequate controls in place that the bureaucrats have in place. Then again, you may have waste, fraud, and abuse, and we've seen plenty of examples of that. But nonetheless, privatization can be a good thing. Contracting out can be a good thing as long as you have adequate controls in place. More competition in terms of service delivery can be a very good thing. Cutting red tape can be a good thing, again, where possible. Sometimes, as one scholar said, one person's red tape is another person's treasured procedural safeguard. What you may think is red tape is actually there for a reason. So again, being careful about where you cut red tape. So where rules and procedures are truly red tape, get rid of those, but where is truly there for a reason, being careful about cutting that. And then the other idea is another idea among others, plenty of other ideas I have as part of this reinventing government movement, is the idea of holding managers accountable not so much for processes, but holding them accountable for the results. So give managers more flexibility in terms of hiring, in terms of procurement, like using credit cards, for example, but and not have to go through this long, detailed process of obtaining supplies and equipment. But again, the idea is holding managers more, giving them more flexibility, but at the same time holding them accountable for the results as well. So by holding them accountable for the results, giving managers more flexibility in terms of how they do things, but holding them accountable for the overall results, again, can be a good thing in terms of reinventing government. So again, a lot of governments at the federal level, state level, and local level have engaged in this reinvention process, and it has had a positive impact in many ways on government. And again, there's some fallout as well, but we can take from these ideas, what works, the best of these ideas, what works, and what doesn't work, discard those, and continually try to make government both more effective as well as more efficient. So anyway, that's one of the things I want to talk to you about in this discussion about control of bureaucracy. Is bureaucracy raging out of control? We've got a lot of controls in place out there, and a lot of these controls are often equated with being red tape, saddling bureaucracy with all this red tape and accountability requirements. But we see there's a reason for doing so too. So some people think that bureaucracy is raging out of control. Other people think that bureaucracy is stuck and mired in the mud because of all these controls. My point for you is for you to understand it can't be both, right? I mean, it's either raging out of control or is it mired in too much control? And again, I think the answer is it's a combination of actually both of these, and it depends upon the particular agency and the context you're talking about as to which one of these tends to be more at play, which one of these forces tend to be more at work there. But in any case, this is probably a good stopping point in terms of bureaucracy. What we're going to be talking about in our next session are, since we've been talking about institutions, the Congress, the presidency, and bureaucracy, what we'll talk about next are some of the outputs of these institutions in terms of policy making. So we'll talk about how policies are made, different models of policy making, the policy process, and we'll talk about this with respect to both domestic and foreign policy. So until then, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.